Hello, my name is Kalen Baker and my mentor is Dr. Ping He, and today we'll be discussing theoretical research on the sintering of metals based on the results of molecular dynamics simulations. So if we look at this video on the right, it's typical sintering behavior. You take grains of material and you pack them together in a mold, and then you fire them, and it fuses into a single object. And so the material we chose was titanium based on its commercial importance and the amount of reference data available, and the reference data set that we used has the temperature between 1000 Kelvin and about 1600 Kelvin. And so to give you some reference, the melting point of titanium is just under 2000 Kelvin, which kind of highlights the importance of the sintering process. It's very energy efficient because you don't have to get it to the full melting point. And if you're going to process something like titanium or molybdenum that has a high melting point, this would be one of the few ways that you could process it, because there are very few materials capable of surviving the heat needed to get those materials up to melting. And so for my simulation, and I'll show you here in a couple of slides, we use slabs of materials to make the calculations easier. And then to generate a grain boundary, we twisted those two slabs 30 degrees to each other so that there was a mismatch between the grain or between the crystal structure that to generate the grain boundary. And so some information for later, as we'll discuss, is titanium has a hexagonal close packed structure that shifts to a body-centered cubic structure at around 1200 Kelvin. And then for molecular dynamics simulations, they typically represent very short time frames and very small scales. This video is roughly 100 nanoseconds and rough maybe 30 nanometers across. So what we were attempting to do was mate my molecular dynamics model to this master sintering curve. And the master sintering curve is just a mathematical way to represent sintering. And so what you do is you take samples off during processing and you measure the shrinkage of the material and the density, and you know the thermal profile during processing. And based on all that information, you can generate a curve that will predict how the material behaves further along in the cycle so that you can get to an optimum density or porosity as applicable. And so that's what this equation here on the left is describing. And so uh, my molecular dynamics model is capable of generating all of these with the exception of these gamma constants, but those can be backfilled based on other information from the molecular dynamics model. And so what this would allow us to do is process potentially expensive to manufacture materials or materials that need an extreme level of processing prior to actually physically running a sample, which would be apprehensive to say if you were going to process something and you didn't know how it was going to behave, and it turns out you wasted a bunch of material to figure out that the material isn't capable of being processed via sintering or some other powder metallurgy method. And to give an example, over here, my molecular dynamics model very clearly generates these diffusion coefficients, and as you can see, they increase with temperature, which is kind of what we would expect as behavior. So my molecular dynamics model was generated using lamps run on a Raspberry Pi cluster that we built out of 15 cards. And the simulations were estimated to take around 2.5 hours. They ended up taking around 2.25. So that estimation was fairly close, and there was some other give and pull, but not including setup or any of the tuning. It took roughly around 200 hours, probably just over, to generate all of the simulations needed to generate the reference data set. And so this was what I was talking about when I said there were two slabs of material. Here in the center is how each simulation started, and as each simulation progresses through its respective temperature, you can see here that at 900 we have some fusion, but at 1500 we get to the minimum energy condition, which is spherical, where you have the maximum amount of volume but the minimum amount of surface area. But no matter what temperature we have, you can see here that there's clearly sintering action and that all of the boundaries fuse to each other. However, we were never able to make the master sintering curve comparison to my molecular dynamics model. We attributed this to two things. One is the potential system. So as I was discussing earlier, titanium is hexagonal close packed and body-centered cubic. And while hexagonal close packed is very close to the face-centered cubic structure, they don't really line up. And so the reason a face-centered cubic structure was used in the calculation of the potential is because it's easier mathematically to use a face-centered cubic structure And so typically if you're going to pull a potential for the embedded atom method, which is the system we used, it's all generated based on a face-centered cubic structure. The other problem with the embedded atom method is that they're all generated using ground state calculations, which is not true at 1600 degrees. There's a lot of energy associated with that. And so you can see here that my diffusion output was much, much higher than a reference based on some physical material. And so that, and as the temperature increased, if we look over here on the right, the time steps needed to complete a simulation went up dramatically as the temperature increased. You can see a slow climb. There's a bump at 1200, which is the crystal structure transition I mentioned. And then the temperature to time step ratio just increased dramatically, which is also not seen here. But as the temperature range increased, I physically couldn't add enough energy to the system to get it to meet the temperature. So after about 1400, I also had to increase the starting temperature of each simulation in order to get it to reach the final temperature that I needed. So that's not really captured here. But even if that wasn't the case, you can clearly see that the number of time steps increases quite dramatically. The other cause of deviation we suspect is probably with the way LAMPS made this mean square displacement or MSD calculation. And that was the comparison we saw between the reference data and what we calculated. And so there are two possible causes. One is this crystal structure transition. It went from face-centered cubic, as you can see here on this picture on the right. It's that green on the first picture, to hexagonal close packed, which is the blue, to body-centered cubic, which is the red. And if you get to the third picture, you can see that it's mostly body-centered cubic, which is expected at this new higher temperature. And then the white you see around the outside is some other not specified crystal structure. And so on the first one, it's because there's an exposed surface, and so it's not really tied to a crystal structure. But as it shifted through this crystal structure, it caused motion, and because the MSD is only looking at a position change, it doesn't really check for the center. It's picking that up as diffusion, which is not really diffusing. The crystal structure is just opening up. The other thing we see is this picture on the left. And so the way LAMPS makes its calculations is you specify a block where it wants to make this calculation. Well, I exaggerated it here a little bit, but if the material is perfectly sphericalized, there's an exposed edge, and so we get a lot of surface motion, and because, again, it's only looking at motion, it's not really truly tracking diffusion, we're getting here is some extra captured motion that doesn't really represent diffusion. And so we're making a new set of simulations that's a block of monolithic material that has no grain boundaries, no exposed surfaces, and we're calculating diffusion in the center of that so that we can verify that the original calculations were in fact correct. The other validation we're going to do is that LAMPS periodically dumps out every 250 time steps position and velocity files, which would allow us to go back and manually calculate the MSD to validate it. However, if we look at this picture on the right, qualitatively, it performs exactly as it expects. It takes these two slabs and it turns them into a sphere. Or if we were looking at the first video, it turns a bunch of spheres into one big sphere, which is also what we would expect. And so there are some further improvements that we need to make on the model. One is to increase the complexity. It would need a furnace atmosphere. We would need more grains. And we need to represent compacting behavior. We also need to increase the scale. Right now, I'm working on incredibly small. In order to more accurately capture some diffusion, the size of the model would need to be increased, which would allow us to capture more grains as well. Another potential source we could look at is that while the diffusion coefficient is pretty accurately calculated as long as you have a bulk material, there is some noise associated with using a molecular dynamics model. Like if an atom gets pinched, it gets ejected deeper in the system. That would never happen in reality, but it could happen inside the simulation. And so that kinetic motion is getting picked up as diffusion. And so there are ways to isolate that noise. And another thing would be to isolate the melting point to figure out where it truly goes molten. And so we can truly just get what we're interested in terms of sintering and not say surface diffusion across the outside, which is not really what we're trying to capture. And then the other thing is the embedded atom method, which is a more long-term thing that has to be worked on, is that these following assumptions have to be overcome. This uniform electron density, the ground state properties, and then it's limited to one background material. well, the uniform electron density really isn't true because the electrons are found orbiting atoms, and then the ground state properties are never really true because, well, we have to heat the material in order to cause this process. And then limited to one background material is really only important when you're dealing with alloys, and so that one will have to be looked at much, much further down the road. This is my references, and I would like to thank the Office of Undergraduate Research for this project, and Dr. Bareem and the members of the OUR for their help and support. Thank you for listening, and I will now take any questions.